Yeah. Okay, we're recording, and we're in the home of Bebe Barron on August 12th, 1998, who so graciously agreed to give us an interview. And I know that you have a musical background that has nothing to do really with electronics, and I wonder if you comment on how you felt that intersected with the part of your career that does have something to do with electronic music.
No intersections. I studied regular conventional music at the University of Minnesota and at the New School for Social Research in New York, and I studied with a couple of really good composers in New York, John Cage being one. And then, but before that, when Louie and I were first married, somebody gave us a wire recorder for a wedding present. And we immediately began to fool around with it, and we figured out, oh, you can change speeds, you can run the wire backwards and forwards, and one thing you can't do is put it back together again after it's been cut. That's a problem. So fortunately, very soon afterwards, the first tape recorder came out, and this is the same one that Hitler used.
Yes, the
same model.
magnetophone.
And that really put us up into business, and we took off for New York with our prized possession, our new tape recorder, and we set up a recording studio there. So there was just no connection between what I had done before and what I wanted to do at this point. So,
do you recall who gave you the tape recorder? Was it?
I sure do. It was a cousin of Louie's who was one of the executives at Minnesota Mining. And he also kept us in tape, experimental tapes, wonderful tapes. I mean, I go back and I play some of these tapes today, and no problem. I mean, they haven't gone bad or anything. So he was the guy who really started us going, and he would drop over all the time and check on us to make sure that the tapes were holding up and all the equipment was functioning right. I don't know if we could have done it without him, but he was wonderful.
Well, a lot of people had wire recorders, and
Did they?
Well, not a
didn't know
lot,
that.
but a number. But I was going to say, and a number of people had those early magnetophones. Bing Crosby. One of the reasons it was done was to delay radio broadcasts and things like that. But not many of them really tried these kinds of experimental things. What do you think it was about you and Mr. Barron that caused that?
I wish I could give you a sensible answer. I have always had a hunger for avant-garde sounds, especially music, sounds, anything like that. I'm just bored to death with listening to the conventional stuff over and over again, and I'm fascinated by new sounds, new music. I don't know what makes some people that way. I only wish there were more of them, because there is such a lousy market for new music. But Louie was the same way. His background was jazz, and he just loved anything avant-garde.
On arriving in New York, you engaged a circle of people that were of a like mind.
That's right.
Very experimental, not just in music, but in art, things like that. What was that like for that period?
Oh, it was just heaven. It was the most wonderful period I think New York has ever had, and it was like Paris in the 20s. Everybody was so fascinated with everybody's work, and including their own, but they were also all very supportive of everybody's work, and it was just a joy to talk about your stuff. And we belonged to something called the Artists Club, which met every Friday night at a bar in the Village, and everybody who was anybody in the avant-garde was there. Everybody, in dance, in architecture, music, filmmaking. It was just a fascinating thing. And one time Louie and I had the guts to get up and talk about our work, and that's how we met John Cage and David Tudor. They came up and talked to us afterwards, and they were just getting this humongous it was so much money. They had just gotten this money from, what's his name? The architect, Williams, something Williams. He was a wonderful architect, and he gave John this money to experiment on sound with. And so the four of us did it for the next year.
It was Williams because that was the Williams mix.
Mix. That's right.
Did you work on that?
Yes, we did it. I mean, we cut tapes for a year, little tiny smidgens of tape, and we spliced them together, and we cooked gourmet lunches for hours on end. John was a great cook. We did the Williams mix. We still have the original tapes and everything.
You have the original tapes of that?
Yep. They're packed away in our earthquake-stricken studio in Pasadena, which I hope will function again soon.
Well, speaking of functioning again soon, would you like to talk some about not just the past, but you've made new work recently?
Well, what happened was Louie and I decided we were going to do a kind of Son of Forbidden Planet record. We had a lot of wonderful material that wasn't used, and a lot of new techniques and a lot of new equipment, and we decided we were going to put together a new record, and we did. We worked on it for a couple of years, really hard, and unfortunately it had the same problem that Forbidden Planet did. You know, when we didn't have any really new, well, I don't even think there was anything. Let's see, when did all that, the great synthesizers come out?
Robert Moog developed his synthesizer in 1964.
64.
And it was popularized around 1970 for the performing musician.
Yeah. Well, we should have had some really modern equipment, but for some reason we were really enjoying the old stuff. And so we had the same problems that we did later. We developed a lot of noise. And somebody had told us that there was new equipment coming out that would really eradicate the noise without eradicating any of the sound. So we decided to set it aside until the equipment came along. And it did come along, and there's a young German composer who was just dying to work on that with me. Louis unfortunately died soon after. And he's got a piece of equipment, I suppose you know what it is, but it's just remarkable what it does. It makes your tape sound clean and crystalline. I just love it. So I will go back and clean up those tapes, because it was a finished record. And then very shortly afterwards, well, not that shortly, but about 5 or so years afterwards, came the earthquake. So we had to set everything aside because there was a lot of damage to the studio. Pasadena was one of the hardest hit. So.
Well, your experiences in New York, you worked with John Cage,
right.
Tudor. Were you aware of a man named R.H. Ranger? Do you remember him?
R.H. Ranger?
Yeah, he worked with NBC and did some other things. I was just wondering what community, there was amongst those.
Who is he?
Well, he too brought an early tape recorder back after the war on the East Coast, and he did the NBC chimes, those electronic chimes and things like that, and had a crazy organ named the Ranger Tone.
Really?
Yeah. But Cage evidently worked in his studio later, after he worked in your studio.
Well, we moved back to California in '62, I think it was, and then we didn't work with Cage anymore. We worked with him for a few years, and it was just wonderful because he brought everybody to the studio, just everybody from all over Europe and here, and oh God, those were the days.
Now, something I didn't know until recently was everybody knows about Poème Electronique with Varese at the 58 World's Fair in Brussels.
Right.
But you had a piece there too.
Yes. Shirley Clark. Do you know who Shirley Clark was? Oh God, she was so great. She was really the first. Do you know who Maya Deren was?
That name is familiar, but I can't place it.
She did underground films using tricks that, I mean, with her camera, she would make a film for $200. So she had to be totally ingenious. That's the right word. And she developed techniques with her camera that were just astonishing. Advertising agencies would steal her ideas. It was just amazing. Everybody wanted to be able to do it. She did it with such brilliance. It was unbelievable. And she and Shirley Clark, for some reason in this period, got started working. Shirley did a film called The Connection, Jack Gelber's play about dope. She did a lot of wonderful films, and her name is still very much remembered. Anyway, she came over to our studio one day and said, I just got a commission from the Brussels World's Fair to do a piece, to do a film, and I don't know what to do. They gave me practically no notice. It was to be sent like a week later. I don't know why they gave her no notice, but they did. And she said, I don't know what to do for music. So we had just finished Forbidden Planet, and we had a lot of stuff lying around that was, you could tell it was from Forbidden Planet. So we said, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll put together a score and lend it to you, and we can't give it to you because it belongs to MGM. So she said, great, let me take it to Brussels, and when I get back, I'll make some permanent arrangements. So we gave her this tape. We made a few cuts and nips and kind of cut it to size, and it just was unbelievable how well it went with her film. It was a film called Bridges Go Round, and your guy, Raymond Weidenauer, is that it?
Ronald Weidenauer, yes.
He did a film very much like this film, Bridges in New York.
Yes.
And I
Brooklyn
can't remember
Bridge.
what it was
Brooklyn
called.
Bridge.
Brooklyn Bridge.
Mm-hmm.
So this was a film very much like that. The music went wonderfully with it. She came back after Brussels and she said, I've got to have a permanent score because it's going to go into distribution. So she got a jazz musician by the name of Teo Macero to do a permanent score. And it was so dramatic, the difference. I mean, what these two scores did for that film, totally different. You would hardly recognize the film.
Yeah.
So she always showed both scores. Fortunately, it was only 5 minutes or something like that.
Do you know where it was played in Brussels? I mean, which pavilion or the details of that?
I know nothing about the Brussels World's Fair.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Even though you were in it.
Her daughter probably knows everything about it. Do you know Wendy?
No.
She's a video artist and wonderful. She lives here.
Is that film commercially available?
I think so.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That'd
Yeah.
be, of course, the version that you made for them would not be available, I guess.
Eventually, I mean, MGM did such terrible things to us. In our contract, it said that they were not allowed to sell our music to any other film, that it was only done for Forbidden Planet. So what did they do? They immediately sold the score to a film called From the Earth to the Moon.
Oh, yeah.
And, which I never saw, unfortunately, but it was all our music. We never got a nickel for it. And we sued MGM. We went around suing MGM at every opportunity. And we never had the money to carry it through to fruition, unfortunately. So, why am I telling you about that?
Well, it's about the Brussels.
Oh, about the Brussels thing. Anyway, why am I telling you about...
It's okay.
I forgot my train of thought. Anyway, we had to, she still always shows both films. when she shows them. People forgot, that MGM owned it. Oh, I forgot.
That's okay. That's all right.
Excuse me. Um, so people eventually forgot that we had done that for MGM, and they have always enjoyed seeing both showings. And always in film composing classes, they always show both of them. At UCLA, they show them. It's just like day and night. It's a very good lesson.
Yeah. The speaking of film scoring, which I know you've done that and other things, Forbidden Planet was by no means the first then of these kinds of things. We talked about this film, which is from the Brussels Fair, which is a couple of years after that. But actually, you have done film scores into the 40s. That's correct, isn't it?
When we first moved to New York, we met a guy named Ian Hugo, who was married to a writer by the name of Anais Nin, and they had done this film together called House of Incest. And Anais also heard our music the night at the Artists Club, and she wanted to use the music for background scoring for that film. And so we did several films for Hugo. We did that one, which is, I think, the best thing. Was the first thing and the best thing that we ever
Was it
had
electronic
done.
or concrete?
Oh, yeah.
It was all electronic. What year approximately would that be?
That's got to be either 49 or 50 or 51, something.
But wasn't there another Bells of Atlantis on the West Coast? Was that West Coast or was that East Coast?
That was East Coast.
Was that earlier? 48, I think I've seen.
I'm not very good on chronology.
But what about that film? What was it like? Was it electronic in the score?
Wonderful, because none of us really knew what we were doing very well, and we were just operating totally from our subconscious. That's what Annie's believed in, and boy, she really did it. We were all doing that. It was straight from the heart, and it was really beautiful.
Was that film for her, with her, Anais Nin?
It was written by her, and she acted in it, and her husband, Ian Hugo, shot it. And the Museum of Modern Art is the only one I know who still has a copy of it. Their copy is going fast, and nobody knows where the master is. So probably lost.
But that was an electronic piece of music prior to probably 1950.
It was when we first moved to New York, which probably around 50. And then we did some more things for Hugo, and we did about 7 or 8 what were then called experimental films. Now they're called underground films, and they were quite interesting. Yeah.
I know the story somewhat, but would you tell the story of how you met the executive from MGM, how you got the job to do...
It's so corny.
But it's still interesting.
It just sounds like a fan magazine in the 50s. It's really terrible, but true. Louis and I were absolutely fearless in those days. I guess when you're young, nothing really scares you. But we decided we were right for Hollywood. And MGM at that time was it. I mean, there was practically nobody else who was making films of stature other than MGM. So we read in the paper that Dory Sherry was coming to town and that his wife was going to have an art show at one of the galleries in town. So Louis and I decided we were going to crash that show. And we wondered, would we recognize Dory Sherry, since neither of us had ever even seen a picture of him. And Louis said, look for the guy who looks the least important. So we get to this place, and here's this guy standing all alone. Nobody talked to him. He was just standing off in the wings, drinking a drink. So Louis said, I bet that's him. So we went up to him and asked if he were Dory Sherry. And he said, yes. And so we commenced telling him about our electronic music. I just can't believe the chutzpah of us. And he said, well, he said, I'd like to hear it. When you're next in Hollywood, give me a call and we'll set up the showing. We'll set up a hearing of your music. So 2 weeks later, we were in Hollywood. And we gave him a call thinking, this is silly, he's never going to see us. He said, can you come over this afternoon? And we said, sure. And we brought over all our tapes that we had brought with us and films and everything. And it turned out he didn't want to see the films, just hear the tapes with his eyes closed. He's a very imaginative man. And he said, do you have any commitments right now? And we said, no. And he said, would you like to work on a film in Hollywood? And the question. So we said, absolutely. So he said, well, it was a toss-up between, it turned out he told us that he had been considering Harry Parch, whose music I loved. I still love it. But he didn't feel it was quite right for this, like electronic music would have been. So he decided to let us do it, and he told Johnny Green, who was the music director, he didn't want any instructions, any directions. He just wanted us to be totally free to do our own thing. It's a dream.
Almost unprecedented.
Almost. I think it probably was unprecedented.
Yeah.
It partly he didn't know what to say to get the results that he was after. I mean, how do you give someone instructions in something that really has never been used before? He was totally open to whatever we did, and was really can spoil one forever.
Now, Forbidden Planet came out in '56, so this had to be a year or two before that, sometime in that time frame.
It must have been '54, I think, because we worked on it a long time.
And again, in 1954, there is no Moog synthesizer. There is really no commercially available thing that you would call a synthesizer.
No, there wasn't.
So you and Louis had to build your own equipment.
That's right.
What about that equipment? I mean, what was it like to actually play and to make happen?
Well, it was, we built circuits is what we did, and they were the funniest looking little things ever. And totally unassuming. I mean, I always think of theremin. When you looked at a theremin, you knew something really wonderful was going to come out of that. But with our stuff, I mean, here was these miserable little circuits that looked like, almost like rat's nests. They were really funny looking. And the whole equipment, I'll show you a picture. Oh, you've seen it. You saw the studio in that magazine. We never knew, we never had any idea what we were going to get in the way of results when we would put together a circuit. But we had a kind of different approach from most people. We would put together kind of like a cast of characters and do almost like leitmotifs for these characters. And we never used our own ideas, our own musical ideas. It just came out of the circuit. The art was in the building of the circuits and the processing that took place afterwards. And it was almost organic the way the sound came out of those things. And I suppose because they were all mathematical formulas and they were quite natural. I mean, they unfolded in mathematical order. And
now, Louis had an interest in electronics.
He was absolutely brilliant with it. He never studied it anywhere.
Do you
Am
need
I
to-
still
Oh,
lined
yeah,
up?
you're fine. Yeah.
Okay. He was totally self-taught. And I guess the reason that he dared to experiment with his own ideas in electronics is because he never studied it in a school or anything like that.
Would he like just go to the store and buy these components? And
Well,
just,
there were a lot of, what do they call them? They were used in our defense, in in our wars, and they were left over. What do they call those?
surplus?
Surplus, war surplus. And he would buy up these crazy little things that probably cost our government $100 for a little something. I don't even know what they were. And Louis would pay a nickel for them, take them home, and hitch them up to our cybernetic circuits. We lifted all those circuits out of the book.
Norbert Wiener. Or
Norbert Wiener.
Yeah.
Uh-huh. And he never dreamt that any of them would be used to make sounds, but they were just wonderful.
The concept of feedback and all the other principles
Mm-hmm.
that were there.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Kean is curious here, and so am I. Did David Tudor have any influence on those circuits? Because he built some things in the early.
Did he?
Yeah, he did a thing called Rainforest. That might have been a little later than you were working. I don't know.
What was it called?
He did something called Rainforest and some other things like that.
Oh, I heard that. I'm sure I must have heard that at the County Art Museum, because we all gathered into a large room where they tried to imitate a rainforest, and then there was this wonderful sound. I don't know a thing about how he did that, or if David did it.
In other words, there's no connection possibly then between David Tudor and Louis on the design of these things. It's more
No,
this
as far as I
cybernetics.
knew, David was a wonderful pianist, and he picked out our piano for us, and that's all I knew about his work. I didn't know that he did anything else. I'd like to hear that though.
You spent quite a while then in the development of this soundtrack and this score, and I assume was it somewhat secret because of this being, you alluded to union ideas about why it was called electronic tonalities. Were you working pretty much under wraps, or were they ballyhooing that it was going to be electronic music? Or?
Well, unfortunately, at that time, the musicians' union had tremendous power in this town, and if you were not a union musician, you couldn't work in a film that had union people connected with it. I suppose it's still somewhat the same in that respect, but there was talk about trying to get us to join the union, but we just couldn't work under union circumstances. I mean, it just was wrong for our kind of music, and they would not bend at all. I mean, we had to work under their rules, or else we couldn't be a member of the union. So Dory Sherry came up with the name Electronic Tonalities to kind of evade the whole issue, and theoretically we were working under the sound department, not the music department, but that wasn't true because Johnny Green was the musical director of MGM, and he was the guy who worked with us. And
Do you want to get there? Oh, yeah.
Leonard's
Okay.
in it.
I guess what I'm thinking too is, did the public know anything that this thing about electronic music was happening at MGM? Or was it?
There was some publicity about it, and the problem was, we found out afterwards that MGM had signed an agreement with the musicians union that they would never use us again, that these were special circumstances and they would never employ us again. And it turned out that other studios joined in on it too. as I said, the union just had unbelievable power. And so consequently, we never were able to work in Hollywood again. We did a lot of plays after that on Broadway. We did a lot of other things, but we never were allowed to do a feature film again. There was
you were blacklisted
Oh yeah,
because it
We
was
sure
electronic
were.
music.
yeah, yeah.
But what about the public? When the film came out, what was the response? I mean,
Oh, they were just, I remember when we had the, what do they used to call those things? Where you fill out things afterwards, saying.
questionnaire, opinion poll,
Yeah.
exit poll.
It was a showing, and they wanted to get the audience's response. Well, they had a showing of it. They didn't advertise what it was, so people came, and they stood up and applauded after the landing of the spaceship. They'd never heard anything like this before, ever. I mean, there was nothing like this heard before, really.
That's right.
There was, you know, those guys in France, Henri and
Chauffeur.
thank you. Yeah, who were doing musique concrète, and but there was nothing purely electronic. And the audience went crazy. They just loved it madly.
So you worked in the late 40s and early 50s, essentially not necessarily influenced by Chauffeur and Henri and Stockhausen
We
later.
didn't even know who Chauffeur and Henri were until we got a letter from them telling us what they were doing, and they invited us to come to Europe and study their techniques and things, but we really weren't doing the same thing. They were closer to what John was doing.
With Williams mix and
Yeah,
things like that.
Right. So we were just sort of operating all by our little selves in the dark. There was nobody wanted to have anything to do with us. You know, none of the universities wanted anything to do with us. It was amazing that we were able to continue. We were in isolation.
The film Forbidden Planet, a technical detail. When you do a movie, of course, you synchronize the music to the image, the picture. Were you involved in that, or did you hand over tapes, or how did you work with Mr. Green, the music director, I assume?
Well,
what was that relationship like? Because it's unlike a symphony orchestra with click tracks and those kinds of things.
Unlike.
Did you get timings from them, or how did that work?
Well, he gave us a work print, a 16 millimeter work print, which we took back to New York with us, and you know, we timed it. Louis and I had we had two projectors that had synchronous motors on them, but they had nothing to do with each other. So, you know, it's just that they ran the same speed every time. And Louis and I developed systems where we could start, well, let's see, I think we had 3 tape recorders at that point. One was built by an outfit called Stancil Hoffman. I don't know if you've ever heard of that or not. That was really before your time. Can't remember who built the other 2, but I don't
Ampex?
think they're around anymore.
Ampex?
Ampex. Well, Ampex came a little later.
Presto?
Never heard of them.
No.
One of them, we had a 16 millimeter sound machine, which we never used somehow. It just didn't fit into the system. But anyway, we would develop these systems. 1, 2, 3, start. And we could start up any number of pieces of equipment really in unison. I mean, we were so attuned to working together that, I mean, we were like one. We really were. So that worked very well. And we developed all kinds of techniques for marking the film and synchronizing our stuff, but none of it had to be that exact, except the footsteps of the monster. That was the one thing that had to be pretty exact. And as I remember, we got it pretty well synchronized. But then I think the sound editor at MGM did the final synchronizing.
So you sent back to Hollywood 1/4-inch tapes, mono probably at that time, monophonic. I mean, not stereo even.
You're right.
Yeah.
It was no, that's not right. Because I remember at the preview, there was a lot of talk about whether they should project it. They had one stereophonic, two tracks print of it, and the rest were all mono. And they tried to decide whether or not they should use a stereo print, and they ruled it out because they didn't think the projectionist would know how to operate the projector, or whether he would be conscientious enough to throw the switch.
You mean across the country? I mean, the actual prints that were going to go out.
They were all monophonic. Yeah. But then when I decided I wanted to bring out a record of it, we simulated stereophonic sound, and it worked pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you didn't have any trouble from MGM about putting that record out or anything?
Oh, God, they're so unbelievable. You've got to promise me, if you ever do anything with this tape, this has to be cut out, or else
I
will
understand.
be sued.
I warrant at this point that I won't publish this.
They are so petty that, I mean, if there were a nickel in it for them, they would pursue whoever is responsible for their not getting their just due. They were unbelievably horrible. I could show you the contract we drew up with them. There had never been a contract like this before. They charged us $3 a record for the rights to bring out our own tapes, to which we owned the copyright on these tapes. But for the privilege of bringing out a record
called Forbidden Planet.
Yeah. They charged us $3 a record.
It's an astounding royalty.
Yeah.
It's just, they were so unbelievable. They did everything they could to stand in our way of ever getting ahead. Oh, God.
Yeah, that's an incredible story about being blacklisted by the union.
Is that something? And then we decided...
And it was many, many years, really.
Yeah.
Even things like Bernard Herrmann had done some things with theremin, but it was always with orchestra.
Yeah.
So the musicians union. I assume the theremin players were union players.
I think they must have been, because there's no reason why you couldn't play a theremin according to the union rules.
Yeah. I've seen it in the book. It's called Etherphone player.
Is that right?
What is it called?
Etherphone player.
Etherphone.
Huh.
You must have heard theremin.
You know, I didn't.
Really?
And this is a weird story. I had never heard of theremin. I saw the film Theremin about 5 or 6 years ago when it came out. I had a girlfriend during this period by the name of Lavinia Williams. She was a black dancer, wonderful. She was a Haitian dancer. And she was a friend also of Anais Nin's. And the three of us were really close. And when I moved to California in '62, I lost track of Lavinia. I never heard her name mentioned again. She was a dancer of some note. And then when I saw this film about 5 years ago, they talked about Lavinia had married Leon Theremin. I didn't know this. This was way before I knew Lavinia. She knew that we were working in electronic music. She knew our music very well. She never mentioned, I was married to Leon Theremin. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing, because first of all, it said that she had died under mysterious circumstances in Haiti. Now, that explains what happened to Lavinia. I never heard from her again. But there was some mysterious thing about should she go back to Russia with Leon. It said in the film, because something about the KGB was
The
after...
KGB kidnapped Leon Theremin. They kidnapped him.
Why?
Well, because he had overstayed his visit in the U.S. He had a visa to stay a little while over here, and the Soviet. He was an important scientist who had developed secret ways of using this kind of technology of eavesdropping and sensing
didn't know
people
that.
and things like that.
I
yeah.
didn't know that.
So the KGB literally kidnapped him and took him back to Russia.
There was some conjecture also that because of his marriage to Lydia, that the ostracization he suffered because of that black-white marriage.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was a lot
So
of...
how do you know about this? I mean,
Because I watched the movie, and I've read a lot about Theremin.
you have?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw the movie about 4 or 5 times, and I'm just dying to talk to the guy who did it, see if I can find out any more about Lavinia. That's the wildest story. Why
I
didn't she
suspect
tell
that's
us?
all he knows, but just for the heck of it here, that film is now out of print.
Is it really?
I fortunately found you one.
Oh,
It's
Oh,
been
you're
previewed,
kidding.
but there it is.
oh my heavens!
Don't get rid of that one because they're going to be hard to find from now on.
Yeah.
Oh, how wonderful!
Yeah.
Oh,
Should like
thank you
that.
so much. I don't want you to spend your
No,
own
no, no,
money
no,
on
don't
it.
worry
No,
about
I
that.
insist. I
No,
insist.
no.
I am so
Please
thrilled
let
to
it
have
be
this.
let it be a memento.
Is this a complete?
That's it. That's the movie.
Oh my gosh! You don't happen to know where that gentleman who made it is?
I know
right?
him quite well.
I
We,
can
but
give
we
you-
both know him. He can help you get in touch with him. His name is Steve
I
Martin.
just talked to him last week, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
You're
We
kidding.
share a passion for old motorcycles.
And again, this won't be published. If it's any solace, Orion is dropping him and hasn't paid him properly, according to him at least. And it just seems like it's endemic to the trade, doesn't it?
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
I was in Minneapolis about 5 years ago, and my niece was telling me there's a museum there that's devoted entirely to theremin. Did you know
Where?
that? Minneapolis.
There's one in South Dakota that has a number of RCA theremins and some Leon Theremin memorabilia, but
Oh,
it's
really?
in Vermillion, South Dakota. But
Well,
close, maybe.
You're out
Could
of
it have moved to Minneapolis, or maybe they moved to Vermillion, I
That's
don't know.
possible.
you're out of
Because this
picture
was
now.
about 5 years ago.
That you're out of picture now. Do you want to?
Excuse me.
I know it's probably not good to just sit in one position.
Does the nose pull back?
I could pull back a little bit.
Here, shall I back up a little?
I guess, yeah. Okay.
I'm going to sneeze right now.
Okay. Maybe we'll stop. Let me ask the question too, or Dave could ask it. Dave Kean.
I'm just curious what techniques, was it all concrete with electronic equipment, then you splice tapes, or
Yes, there was a lot of tape splicing involved. But we used all the conventional things of the time. This was before transistors, before... What did we use? We used the sound generator, we used knobs, we used just any kind of electronic equipment we could lay our hands on. There was a great deal of the most basic kind of processing that we did. Like in Forbidden Planet, the monster stuff was actually the love music slowed down over 100 times. And I mean, when we slowed down things, it wasn't like slowing down things today.
With Sam.
We had to put it through, we had to build up the capstan, thank you. And we would put this through Well, we figured out the monster theme was slowed down over 100 times by manual methods. And you can imagine the kind of noise we built up. That's the real problem with it. I loved doing it that way. It was so much fun.
So there may be a dozen or 20 generations from tape?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So would some of the devices that you mentioned earlier that Louis would buy as military surplus or whatever
Yeah.
be oscillators and that sort of equipment?
No, I don't think oscillators. Would there have been oscillators
Yeah.
available that way? Well then, yeah.
Yeah, I mean even as early as like 48, 49, I mean Dave Packard was building tube oscillators, you know, I mean, so it could, I'm just curious
I
as to
remember
whether-
we had a Packard. That I do remember.
Mhm.
Did you have filters? Do you remember that?
Yes, well, Louis built
He built his own.
the filters, yeah. I don't remember if there were commercially available filters then or not. I don't know.
Was there a reverb unit? A
We
plate
had our
reverb?
own feedback system,
Oh, I see.
very primitive.
Slapback, echo, kind
Right.
It's one of the things that struck,
re-entry on the tape.
Uh-huh.
one of the things that struck me most about the film was some of the reverberation, some of the spatial things that happened with the sound. I recognize the sound as you know, some sort of synthesis, but the effects that you talk about, the processing that you talk about,
Yeah.
was really fresh and different. I mean, I didn't understand what it was at the time.
Well, I mean, they were so basic, it's ridiculous to even think about them, but we would like take a tape, run it backwards, and add echo to the tape running backwards, which gave it a totally different quality. Just this most ridiculous, childish things. That's all we had at our disposal.
Creative.
So I guess a lot of the originality of it must have come from the circuits themselves. I mean, using circuits.
Maybe it
in
came
this-
from the people too.
Yes, I think so.
You said, well, you were blacklisted in
Yes.
Hollywood, but you went back to New York to Broadway, and did you do electronic things there as well?
Oh yes, we did a lot of plays on Broadway. I don't know, I always liked working with film better somehow, but it worked fine with plays, and there was a guy there by the name of Cyril Richard,
Mhm.
very well-known actor. He got his first for something called Visit to a Small Planet that Gore Vidal wrote,
Mhm.
and it was just a wonderful production of it. And he got very superstitious. He insisted upon having our sound with everything he worked on. So he did a whole series of plays. That was really at the peak of his career. So we did about 4 Cyril Richard plays, and we must have done about 8 or 10 plays on Broadway. And that was,
The
Lovely.
music, I assume, was played on tape recorder, or
yeah,
yeah. In other words, it was just delivered as tape and played
right,
that way. Were any of these plays, was the music exclusively
yes.
the soundtrack?
Yes, Visit to a Small Planet
That was an example.
It traveled to a lot of small theaters throughout the country, and we had a contract that said whenever they did perform Visit to a Small Planet, they had to use our music. So that was very nice.
Yeah.
But we couldn't get the film to score because we were blacklisted, and boy, nobody would give us the time of day.
It's interesting because Dory Sherry
Uh-huh.
had really had an avant-garde idea, and that idea got truncated for many years then after that. Of course, electronics appears heavily in film scores now,
Yes.
you know, and I suppose that it's still regulated, I mean, in terms of union activity and things like that.
I'd
But-
love to know.
Well, it's been accepted. I can tell you some stories that the Moog synthesizer was banned in London
Oh, you're kidding.
The RCA synthesizer created a tremendous furor in 1955 in New York with the Musicians Union. Leopold Stokowski had actually dreamed of having a so-called centronic organ orchestra of 6 organ players, photoelectric instruments, in the 30s, which
Oh
the
my
union
God.
wrote him a letter and asked him not to do.
Is that so?
Yeah. But how do you feel? I mean, do you have any sense of vindication as a pioneer of this thing to realize that everybody is, just practically everybody is using electronics in film scores now? And there's John Williams occasionally will write a total orchestral score, a few people like that, but even if it's just to sweeten or to thicken or to add
Yeah.
to the orchestra, it's just totally commonplace.
Yeah. I really don't feel that I want to get even with anybody or, timing is everything, and obviously we were at the wrong time. What I don't understand is that the musicians union has, what do you say, when they have jurisdiction over Broadway plays, don't they?
Yeah.
I mean, we were
Somehow
never.
you did that.
That's weird. I
Yeah.
have no memory at all.
Well, it really depends on locals. Like 802 in New York might have had a more forward-looking viewpoint
That may be.
than realized.
Yeah.
I mean, were you paid residuals when these plays went around? Did you get
Oh,
money for
yeah.
each time they played?
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
it was very lucrative. It was wonderful. Yeah.
So, what activities, if you did, that took quite a while to do, what, a dozen stage plays? That must have taken a number of years.
We did all kinds of things, but nobody cares or remembers what we did in New York. I mean, we did lots of dance, modern dance. We worked with all the really good modern dancers, and
Nikolai, Ailey, anybody like that?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Because Alwyn Nikolai was the first person to buy a Moog synthesizer.
Was he really?
Yeah.
And did he compose on it
He
himself?
composed on it,
Uh-huh.
and there is actually a CD out of his music on that.
Uh-huh.
Were any of those stage plays recorded? Possibly. I mean, your music.
Yeah.
I mean,
Oh, you mean
on
did they bring
commercial
a commercial
release.
recording?
Yeah.
Well, there was one called The Happiest Girl in the World, which Cyril was in, and it was a musical using our music and, what's that guy's name? The French composer who wrote oh my God. Oh, I can't believe it.
Can you tell me anything you wrote? I may know him.
Of course you would. Everybody
Not Maurice
knows.
Jarre.
Who?
Maurice Jarre.
No, he had written around 1890 or 1900.
Oh,
and
Debussy.
no, he wrote a lot of dance music.
Mio?
Who?
Darius Mio?
No, that's too
Dance.
highbrow.
Dance music. Offenbach. Offenbach.
Yeah, Offenbach.
Can
yeah.
and such.
Right. Yeah. So there was this musical using our music and Offenbach, which is really weird.
Was your music tonal at that time?
No,
Did you ever do tonal music?
never. We did some tonal things for Forbidden Planet, but we thought they weren't half as interesting as the stuff the machines came up with themselves. And this really is true. I mean, it was so dull, it was so limited in compared to the sort of stuff they turned out, and then we worked with their ideas. We once had a bunch of scientists come up and visit us from San Diego, from not Scripps, but the Salk Institute. They had read about our circuits that had a lifespan of their own. This is true too. I mean, we would get one of these circuits going, and It would start out very kind of softly and would reach a tremendous peak each time, and after the peak it would die. And there was absolutely nothing you could do to regenerate that circuit. And it was fascinating, because there are a lot of those circuits in Forbidden Planet where
It was a one-time thing.
yes,
Record it now or it won't come back.
that's right. So we had to record every note of sound, and then we would process it afterwards, because you could never be sure of ever getting it again. And when the scientist died, when Morbius died, that was one of those circuits. I mean, as he was dying in his studio,
I remember.
the circuit was dying too.
That's an astounding philosophy. Totally.
A lot of very mystical things that happened in those days. Of course, we were only too thrilled to go along with all the mysticism. But these guys from La Jolla, from
Salk?
yeah, they were absolutely fascinated, because they were working on the secret of life. And one of the things that had to do with the secret of life was the whole life and death process. And so they thought there was some connection, some analogy between our circuits, and I don't know.
But you weren't really approaching it, either of you, really, probably, Louis or you, from a scientific viewpoint.
Well, Louis was always very scientific.
Was he?
Yeah, he was much more scientific than musical. After we were divorced, he tried to do some things on his own, and it was a collaboration that, neither of us could really function alone. I have this letter, oh God, it's such a funny letter from Wendy Carlos
No.
about the nature of collaborations, and she had just had the operation, and she was collaborating with
Rachel.
Is it
Elkind?
Rachel? I can't remember her
Well,
name.
it was Rachel Elkind, and there was a musicologist, Benjamin Folkman.
Oh yeah?
Benjamin Folkman. They were involved with Switched on Bach in a kind of a tripartite
Oh.
collaboration, evidently.
Oh. It was a fascinating letter.
Do you have that letter?
I do.
Oh my gosh.
I would have to.
I know Wendy quite well. If it's
Do
at
you
all,
really?
I do. If it's at all possible for me to get a copy of that, I'd love to. I would ask her, of course.
I'll tell you
and
the problem. The problem is, she
Yeah.
would never have a copy of it. Because it was something that obviously she sat down and wrote by hand, and very informal. And, my problem is I have reams and reams of things connected with Forbidden Planet, and I'm going to have to weed out a lot of stuff, obviously. What I'd love to do is sell the house and move to something small in another city, hopefully. I can't stand this place anymore. It's just so awful.
Here.
Isn't it? Ugh.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm going to have to go through all that stuff. It's in one of the boxes, and when I come across it, I will remember that you would like a copy of it.
All I can say is that things that you think are not very important, they probably are more important than you think, because the full documentation is what posterity deserves.
Yes, you're right.
So
Uh-huh.
somehow to microfilm all that or copy it or something like that
Uh-huh.
should be happening.
Yeah.
Bebe, could I ask you a question? When Louis was designing these circuits, just as a matter of intention, do you think that he specifically strove to make them drive themselves to this climactic ending? I mean, when he designed the circuits, do you think that he had that kind of cyclic idea in mind about them?
No, I don't think he had any idea that that could possibly occur. It just, in going back, the best circuits that we used, this happened with all of them. And I've saved some of the circuits. You can see what they look like, but believe me, they're nothing to look at. It was us that did that at a later point when we would, we would connect them up to other circuits and all kinds of electronic equipment, and they would like have a nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
You could hear them
Yeah.
struggling and
It's
suffering, and
fascinating.
it was horrible. And then they would they couldn't do it anymore, and they would just die.
Do you think that did you two learn little empirical ways of getting and did you try to replicate them ever? Did you say we need something like this that has a basic tonality that's sort of like this, and we know it's going to croak, but let's build one anyway?
We could never do that. We could never imitate ourselves in that way. I mean, we could never rebuild a circuit. We tried lots of times.
When you went to New York after Forbidden Planet, Louis continued to build circuits.
Oh, yeah.
Just, in other words, a proliferation of new kinds of circuits and things. Well, what happened when things like the Moog synthesizer came out and things like that?
Well, it's very strange. What year did you say that was?
The very earliest Moog was 1964, but
64.
Carlos's record came out in 68, and that propelled it tremendously.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't really with the performing musician. There were a few performers, but it broke with the Mini Moog and the ARP 2600 about 1970. You know.
I don't know. I've often thought why we didn't really pursue it when all the modern equipment came out. We sort of just let it drop at that point. And I have thought that maybe some of Cage's philosophy rubbed off on us. He was the snob of the age. He always used to tell us, when the public catches on to your work, you got to move on to something else. And we just accepted that. When everybody starts doing it, you can't do it anymore. And looking back at those times, I mean, I almost do believe that still. Although I would love to have had some Moog equipment. I think we couldn't afford it. We were very poor, and then we had a child, and my God, the three of us almost starved to death because Louis he didn't want to work, it was hard to get him even to work on the music. He wanted to sit around and read books, and he was a real scholar. So I think it was more because of money that we never got any really modern equipment. I thought Moog was just wonderful.
So that must have been kind of after some of these stage plays that were so lucrative. I mean, what about the latter period? Of after the stage plays and things like that. Did you continue working in New York or?
We moved here in '62, and we had this little child with us. He was 3 years old, and we never really got back into it very heavily again. Because when you're blackballed and you're not going to be able to do any films, we were called to do one film called The Haunting of Hill House.
I love that movie.
Do you remember that?
I love that movie. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, Bob Weiss called us, and he wanted us to do a score for it. And that was the thing that made us move from New York to here. And we got here, and he had found out about the curse on us while we were moving from New York to here, and he couldn't employ us. And that just sort of broke our spirit.
Yeah.
And there was no theater here. So, there wasn't a whole lot of... We did one play with, oh my goodness, that wonderful writer who is still alive, and I still see him all the time. He did a lot of stuff for radio. He was one of the greats. Anyway, it was something at UCLA and was very good, but theater here is something quite different.
Oh yeah, than New York.
Yeah.
So you had worked at some odd times as a prose editor, had you not? Did you go back to that?
As what?
Editor of writing, prose, or am I wrong on that? I thought you'd been at a publishing company at one point. Maybe I got that garbled.
I'm thinking.
No, that's okay.
I don't remember ever
Okay.
having been.
Okay, I must be wrong about that.
Well, I used to work for a magazine. I was with Life magazine.
Ah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, when I first got out of college.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then another magazine afterwards after I got married. But somehow the music field was, for us it was just nothing anymore.
And so you really didn't produce from mid-60s, let's say?
Well,
Or?
no, let's see, we did a record. Well, then we got back together again. We worked for about 3 years on this record, which is very good. I like it a lot. And I have to sort of make my peace with Louie's second wife.
Mm.
And unfortunately, that has not been easy.
Mm.
She always felt, like she deserved more of a place in music. And maybe she did. I don't know. I haven't really resolved it in my head. But I know that I devoted like 30 years of my life, 40 years of my life to that music. And I don't know. It's not good,
Yeah, I understand.
It's not good when that sort of question enters into it.
Mhm.
Yeah. But I'm going to have to make some kind of adjustments with her, and maybe she'll let me bring out that record, because it really was one of the best things we did, and quite unlike anything else.
Non-tonal, once again.
There are things in it that are quite tonal, not like popular music,
Yeah.
certainly, but you can hum it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you already have a post-production idea about and people to help you with this, or?
With that record?
Yeah.
Well, this is where I was saying that this young German composer who's very big in Germany, he does a lot of scoring of movies and television. He came and looked me up, and also another guy who was with Tangerine Dream.
Peter Bauman.
Oh, I know him. That's not who I was thinking of. It's a
Christopher
guy
Falk.
named Paul. Oh my goodness, I just saw his name. He did some music for that film on Hong Kong Box or something like that. Paul Hesslinger.
Oh, Hasslinger, yeah.
Yeah,
He works
yeah.
with Brian Eno a lot, and
yeah,
Power Spot. Yeah, I know him.
yeah.
He was at our studio last year, as a matter
Oh,
of fact.
was he
Yeah.
really?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's doing a lot of kind of interesting things. He looked me up too, and he offered any of his equipment. He's got, well, I didn't know ever what the arrangement was with that other man that you mentioned, whose equipment was
Bound.
whose. Yeah, I don't know, but there was a vast amount of equipment in that studio.
Well, if you ever need any help, and I would be, gratis, literally.
Oh, that's
anything.
terribly nice.
We have all that kind of processing, and
Have you
the
really?
cleaning up process you were talking about is easily done. Plenty of
God,
resources
that's
that
lovely.
way. Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
sounds like you
I've
might
got
have
it.
it covered.
Have we got that on
Yeah,
tape?
yeah, oh no,
Oh, yeah.
No, Tom knows me. It's it's not. Just to get it done. We do this sort of thing frequently. This.
It really
Needs to
works out
happen.
well, does it?
That's wonderful. It takes a musical sensibility, so you don't cut out the wrong stuff, and all that. But I'm real familiar with the equipment, and I'd be happy to help you with it. It'd be just to get it out there. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, save.
You said earlier. You said well, you could actually see these circuits. Is that in Pasadena, or do you actually have a few of them here? The circuits that you were talking about.
Yeah.
Do you actually have some of them here in this house?
No, not in this
yeah.
house. In Pasadena, where the studio was. I've been trying to decide. I think they have some historical value.
yes.
I'm not
Oh, yes, they
sure.
do.
Absolutely.